Hi, and welcome to Verity Babs Art, where I talk to my friends about art. Today I'm talking to Daniel Nils Roberts, who is an amazing comedian and filmmaker, and we talk about the work of Nikolai Astrup, and we talk about Norwegian folklore and the relationship to the landscape, and I really hope you enjoy it. I'm here with Daniel Roberts. Daniel, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Daniel Roberts, or Daniel Nils Roberts when I do, professional things. I am a comedian and filmmaker, is what I go for. It's a portfolio career, isn't it, Verity? I perform in a show called Ostentatious, which is an improvised Jane Austen comedy, which is meant to be on at the West End, but obviously not anymore. And I make short films. Yeah.
So today you picked a really interesting piece, and do you want to just sort of introduce it and where you came across it and why you picked it?
Yeah, so this painting is by a Norwegian artist called Nikolai Astrup. I think it's just called Midsummer, although he seems to have a few on that theme. Maybe he didn't give them titles and they've just arbitrarily called them things afterwards.
I'd guess.
Yeah. But this shows a sort of riotous midsummer celebration in Norway, with all the bonfires by the side of the fjord. I chose this painting not necessarily because it's like my favorite painting or something I think about all the time, but because at the moment in lockdown, when I look out the window, it sort of looks a lot like that, and without the dancing. So we should
clarify that's because you are in Norway.
I am in Norway, and I think he's from maybe a slightly different part of Norway from where I am. I'm on the west coast, near Haugesund, sort of north of Stavanger, but I'm next to a fjord with the mountains behind me and the trees. I feel like I'm now just sort of rubbing it in to anyone who watches this video. But yeah, I think it felt like it captured the past of the kind of place that I'm in now.
And where do you find it? Where have you seen it from?
Well, I think I can't remember exactly. I know my mum was always very into like Norwegian art. She's half Norwegian and she studied in Norway for a while and painted here. You know, she was like a keen amateur painter. And so she did a lot of landscapes of her own. And so probably this is someone she would have shown us. But I definitely fell in love with his art a little bit more in Bergen, which is a town another one on the west coast of Norway, the second biggest town in Norway. And I went up there I used to live there, but I went back for a wedding and we went to the gallery and they had a lot of Astrup paintings. And he's not very well known in Britain, but I think he did have a big exhibition maybe like 3 or 4 years ago at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. Is that the name of it?
That certainly is a gallery.
Yeah, I think he was there. So that was kind of launching him in the UK.
It's got such brilliant colours in it. I'm a bit mesmerised by the smoke coming off the flame.
It's quite hypnotic, isn't it? Or sort of like intoxicated, maybe. I think what he really captures very well is like, I guess in Norway the seasons are felt much more acutely than in Britain. Mm-hmm. You know, it's so dark through winter, so dark and cold and wet. And like coming here in March, as soon as the lockdown happened, I sort of fled for Norway. And here it was oppressive. It was like dark and wet and pretty grim. And then over the last 2 months, it's turned into summer. And suddenly the days are so long that like we can't sleep at night, you know, because the curtains are too thin. And I think what this painting captures a little bit is that that shift in Norwegians. It's like when the sun comes out, they just go for it, you know, like there's this cliche in Norway that like as soon as the sun's out, they'll take all their clothes off and get absolutely hammered, you know. It's like they have a word for an outdoor, having a beer outdoor in the sun. There's like a word for that, utepis. And so I think they really value summer. And I think in this painting, everyone is like, there's that sense of them just absolutely making the most of it.
Yeah. And is that the dancing, is that something you sort of relate to on like a cultural level? Is that something that you would have been like raised around in a kind of country dancing way?
Not really, no. I mean, so my childhood was spent mostly in Scotland, so I haven't had the authentic Norwegian experience. I'm not sure, like, Yeah, I don't think they dance particularly. Another interesting thing about Astro actually is that a lot of his paintings, it's not so much in this one, but have someone in the foreground looking at what's happening. They're not part of the fun. And I think I relate to that. It's like a desolate silhouette on the hillside wishing they could be part of it. Well, it's FOMO, isn't it? I think I'm very driven by FOMO, and I think Astrup, he often painted that. I don't know if he was relating to that.
I don't know. It's one of those pieces where I'm struggling to say much about it, other than the fact that I really like it, and I think it's to do with the colours and how they blend in with each other. Which I have to remind myself is a completely acceptable opinion to have on art, is I really like it because of the colours.
Trying to think about, like, in film or something, they might talk about the director as a presence. Like, would you account for the painter's position as, like, does that situate him in this painting? Is he someone onlooking because of where the painting's taken from? Like, do you think about paintings in those ways, about the narrator?
So in this, like, he has sort of positioned himself, and so, you know, his eyes are our eyes as a viewer, on top of sort of hillock, and we're like watching on as well. So I guess in some ways we are that solitary figure who's watching on, you know. And it is interesting which artists do that and don't do that. When America started to have its own artists, there was a lot of landscapes where that would be the case. So these landscapes of, you know, Niagara Falls and this kind of thing, where we're meant to completely be bowled over by the beauty of it, and the artist has specifically chosen a vantage point for us to be looking through, so it looks like we're actually really close to the falls, or we are in the middle of this woods or whatever. I don't know, I can't tell whether Astro wants us to be involved or to just watch and not be, you know, he wants us to have FOMO in this. I'm not sure. Did you come to filmmaking as a sort of creative practice? In the same way with comedy, was that something that you approached from a creative side or a more technical side?
Definitely creative, yeah. So, like, art was my favourite subject at school, and like painting in particular. And so there was part of me that was like, oh, I should just run off and be an artist. I don't think I was very good at it, but I really liked it. And then I went after school for a year and did painting in Norway on this. There's these things called folk high schools in Norway, where a lot of Scandinavians go to them in between school and uni. It's like, maybe it's kind of either where you try something out, like something creative, to see if that's what you want to spend your life doing, or you get it out of your system maybe and then go on to your boring career. But yeah, so I did that. And then I think, yeah, I was definitely just attracted to the visual side of it. I think as a filmmaker, I'm not very good really at coming up with, I don't have things I want to say, I think. But if someone gives me something to say, I think I can say it well. So it's quite a visual thing. But yeah, I'm rubbish at the technical side. What I quite like about filmmaking, and maybe painting or whatever is the same, is that people don't know what you did to get to the final product. It's like, I use all these shonky get-arounds, and you can just cut it all out, all the errors you made and all the, you know, bits that were out of focus or whatever. So I can make something that looks good in the end, because nobody knows how badly I cut corners to get it there.
And I guess with filmmaking, there is an element of getting the perfect image and everything completely in focus. So it's interesting looking at this Astro piece, because, you know, the figures aren't completely realistic. Not many of them have faces, and it's sort of quite abstract in that sense, but there is still that complete aesthetic joyousness of it without it being kind of hyper realistic.
No, that's definitely the first paintings I kind of fell in love with as a teenager were like expressionist stuff. Because I think this captures that kind of, that wild festivity better than something that looked exactly like. It's like that thing of, in filmmaking, it's really hard to say film a scene in a club that looks good. You know, if you take your camera in and film people dancing, it looks really shit. But if you find some abstract way to represent that, it's actually a better way of capturing the experience of something like that. And I think Expressionism, I suppose, has that.
Well, it's like when they were first able to take photographs of horses, of how horses actually move. And in paintings, they'd always made horses look really majestic and given like the feel of how horses move. And then they took a photograph of a horse and they're like, God, it looks awful. Why is it moving like that? In the Astro piece, you get more of a sense of everyone's having a great time and properly moving about and going wild for it by it not being an accurate depiction of how people look when they dance.
And I suppose the fires on the hill as well, like that's saying this same thing's happening all the way around the corner, isn't it? There was this a few days ago on the 17th of May, it's Norway's National Day. Mm-hmm. And in the morning at like 7 a.m. or something, there was just this massive explosion. And we just woke up and absolutely terrified. Like this, there was no other conclusion than that this was the nuclear apocalypse, but it was this salute that they did in the town, and then it like echoed off in the next town, and then the next one, and it had this same kind of vibe, like each town along the fjord, with this sort of celebratory explosion, but far more terrifying than this looks.
That is a really lovely detail of this, and like the smoke kind of forming into one at the top, where this like communal feeling. It's very like sentimental, and like, and in that expressionist way, that's not what fire looks like, but that's what fire feels like it looks like, or looks like it feels like,
I think there's also an element of like Norwegian society at that time was very traditional and quite like, closeted, and so he's almost painting the one day of the year when this happened, like the rest of the time it's pretty grim, like just farm life and marrying someone up the road and quite Christian probably, and like they're absolutely cutting loose on this one day,
getting crunk.
And so I wonder, like, because presumably that's what his life was like a little bit. He's repeatedly drawn to this scene. He's done a lot of paintings, I think, without knowing his work that well, of like these bonfires on the hillside. So obviously, like, there was something pretty thrilling to him about that one day of the year when you could let it all hang out.
So it's got like a guesstimated date of after 1917, and I'm not hot on Norwegians' role in the First World War or anything like that, but it is really interesting to think about all these things happening concurrently.
Because Munch obviously is the famous Norwegian artist from this period, and there is a bit of similarity, I think, in some of the figures and colours.
From my impressions of Scandinavian art, especially from like this period, there is just such an emphasis on landscape and traditional culture and celebration of that, and those two things are so completely tied to each other as well. The landscape being so important to Scandinavian heritage, and the idea of what it is to be Scandinavian is so tied to what the landscape looks like in that part of the world. That might be something that happens far more than anywhere else in the world, the idea of the landscape being super important to what your idea is of what it is to be someone from there.
Yeah, definitely. One of the did this short film like a year ago or so where we went to Iceland, and it was about their elf belief, and they talked about how the context for that is that a lot of people in Iceland at least nod to the idea of there being elves or some sort of spirits in nature, and some fully believe it to an extent that's not seen widely in the Western world, I suppose, with our folklore. But the idea was that it's this, you're living in this wild nature, and it starts to become personified. You need to have some way to kind of explain all these things that are happening, and your nature takes on this kind of personality, I suppose, around you. And I think that's reflected in Norway a little bit as well. I guess we used to have that in Britain, but like, the trolls and there's a lot of folklore. And a lot of that comes into other, like there's a painter called Theodore Kittelsen who does all these like folklore paintings of Norway, all the like weird animals that come out of the fjords, or like, strange mythic creatures. And that seems quite interwoven into the nature. Because we used to have like a lot of fairy stuff, didn't we? All the like hills would be fairy hills and changeling babies and things. That's not really part of our like consciousness anymore, I don't think, is it?
No, or I think if you ask someone to draw a picture of what a natural landscape in England looks like, it's going to be basically the same picture they draw for most Western European countries. And as soon as you get into Scandinavia, it's this kind of glorious, vast expanses of water and sky, and that's what Norway looks like. Where can we follow you, hear from you, see things you're making?
That's a good question. I suppose I take photos of Norway on Instagram at Daniel N. Roberts. And then I mean, the main way you could, in theory, see me would be the ostentatious shows and tour, but they're all postponed or cancelled.
Yeah.
So just write Daniel Nils Roberts into the internet, and you'll wend my way. Ignore all the bad reviews.
Thanks so much for watching. You can follow Daniel in the ways written below, and you can follow me at VerityBabsArt on Instagram. And please do give this a like, a share, whatever you fancy, and I'll see you next Monday.